I'll have to tell you right at the start that I'm surprised I'm even here to tell you this story. Oh, I realize I'm in a rather high-risk profession to begin with, but this was by far the closest that I have ever come to death. I mean, I really didn't think we'd make it. But let me go back. Let me start the story at the beginning. You know, it all started out fairly innocently enough one day when I received a message to report to the commander's office. Now, you know, being called in to the boss's office, that can be a good thing, that can be a bad thing. But I couldn't think of anything that I had done wrong, so I figured, it must be okay. Well, I got in there, and the commander told me that even though I was a relatively new centurion, he had decided to put me in charge of taking a group of prisoners to Rome. I was told to prepare to leave within 3 days. Well, I was honored that they were willing to entrust me with such a responsibility, and it was exciting to think about visiting Rome, Rome, the capital of the empire. But it would also mean there was a downside to this trip, and that was being apart from my wife and my little 2-year-old daughter for a long time. Oh, sure, I'd been away before, but never really for very long. And this was going to be a bit longer. I did some checking around at the docks, and it sounded like there was a possibility that I could be back by winter if everything went well, but if not, I wouldn't be back until the next spring. Well, it was still dark when I kissed my wife and very sleepy little daughter goodbye, promising to return with some souvenirs from Rome as quickly as I could. And then I was off to meet the soldiers who I had chosen to accompany me on this mission and pick up our human cargo at the jail. We had to be on the ship when it pulled out of port at daybreak. Well, when we arrived at the jail, the guards had the prisoners all ready. They were lined up, all ready to go. They were already chained. Each of them had been given a small pack of provisions for the trip. And as my men began to lead them off towards the docks, I hung back. I stayed back a little bit and asked the guards, if there were any of them that I should maybe particularly watch out for. And they told me which ones I should keep my eyes on. But they also told me about one of the older prisoners. They said, Paul's not like your regular prisoner. He won't be any trouble at all. You'll see. And I was also given an official document stating that some arrangements had been made for 2 men to accompany this prisoner Paul on the journey, a doctor and another man. Well, we got to the ship, we got on the ship, we headed out, and I will tell you that I sure enjoyed that first day at sea. I mean, it was nice. It was nice once I got my sea legs. And it was kind of embarrassing. I made the mistake of losing my balance. You get out there in the waves, and I made kind of a spectacular dive, really, into a pile of ropes. But unfortunately, I did that in front of some of the prisoners. And let me just say that their remarks about that were less than kind. But my soldiers, they were smart enough to keep their thoughts to themselves and keep their mouths shut. But that aside, that was a little embarrassing. Just being out there, the salty sea air and hearing the sound of the wind in the sails, that was just such a refreshing change from the dusty, noisy streets of Caesarea. Now, normally I would have no interest whatsoever in talking to a prisoner. I don't really waste much time with prisoners, but my curiosity was aroused by what the guards had told me about this one particular prisoner, Paul. And it didn't take very long to see that, he was not a normal prisoner. He didn't act or talk in the manner that I had come to expect from someone who was incarcerated. So I decided maybe I would find out a little bit more about this Paul and the men who were traveling with him. Never hurts to know who you're dealing with, right? Well, I went over to talk to them. I ended up talking to those men for about 3 hours that day. It seems that Paul was some kind of a Jew who had at least partly changed his religion to become what he called a Christian or something like that. And apparently he had been locked up for well over 2 years without his case ever being heard or ever being settled. And because he was a Roman citizen, he had apparently appealed to have his case heard by the emperor, and that was why he was being taken to Rome. Those 3 men, they had some interesting stories to tell. I couldn't believe it. In fact, Paul's friend Aristarchus even told me this story about one time when Paul had been in prison in Philippi, and apparently in the middle of the night there was this massive earthquake, and it jarred open all the prison doors, and it broke all of the chains that were holding the prisoners. But did Paul escape? No. And somehow he convinced all the prisoners to stay until the jailer arrived. Now, I'll have to admit, I've heard a lot of garbage from a lot of prisoners, but I would normally have a hard time swallowing a story as incredible as that. Like, come on, give me a break. But somehow, in this case, I don't know, it didn't seem so hard to believe. There was just something about these men that I really liked. The next day, we reached our first stop, a place called Sidon. We were going to be there for a while, so when Dr. Luke came and asked me if it would be all right to bring some of Paul's friends who lived in that place down to the dock to see him, I did kind of a strange thing. Instead of having Paul's friends come to see him, I gave Dr. Luke and Aristarchus permission to take Paul into the city to see them instead. And of course, I sent along one of my soldiers just to make sure that they all came back. Although, actually, I really wasn't that worried about Paul trying to escape. I knew he actually wanted to get to Rome. And from talking to him, I just felt that I just felt that I could trust him. But it's still in my business, it's always wise to play it safe. And so I just put in that protection. So I mentioned before that I really enjoyed that first day of sailing, but let me tell you what, after a few days on the sea, the novelty definitely wears off. I began to realize that this trip was going to take us forever. Forever. Every day it was the same story. Oh, the winds are against us. Well, how's it going today? Oh, the winds are against us. How about now? Oh, the winds are against us. The winds are against us. It's like we went nowhere. This ship that we were on actually wasn't going all the way to Italy. So when we disembarked at a place called Myra, I left the prisoners in the care of the soldiers, and I started walking the docks hunting for our next ride. And you got to negotiate. It took me a while. But eventually I found this big grain ship from Alexandria down in northern Africa, and it was headed for Italy. And so I, did some negotiation with the owner. I even worked out a pretty good deal with the owner on the cost of our fare. In fact, I was pretty proud of myself. I got Dr. Luke on for free because I convinced the owner that having a doctor on board would be an asset to his whole operation. So I, saved the empire some money. Well, this was a much bigger ship than the one we had been on before, much bigger. And they counted everybody to make sure they knew who was there with the crew and the passengers, 276 people on this big boat. But you've got to understand, these were not like some kind of vacation cruise ships that you have today. If you're thinking of some luxury resort on the water, this was not it. These were cargo ships. And passengers were simply a sideline for them. Now, because I was a Roman official, the owner was able to find a little cot for me to sleep on, but the regular passengers, there's no cot. You just had to bunk out up on the deck or down among the bags and bins of grain, wherever you could find a spot. That was where you slept. Well, we started off on this bigger boat, and if I thought we had been traveling slowly before, I am sure that this new boat was going backwards half the time, if we were even moving at all. It just seemed like we were just sitting there dead in the water, going absolutely nowhere. It was boring. But then it wasn't boring, because then around Sinaitis, suddenly the wind really kicked up into gear, and it was forcing us to go a whole lot faster. Suddenly we were moving a little faster than I was comfortable with. It made us sail to the south of the island of Crete just to get some protection from it. It was just going at us, and it was pretty rough there for a while. I'm not a on the sea kind of a guy, and man, that was a little rough, but it was tense. But thankfully, we made it to this port called Fair Havens. Isn't that a nice sounding place? Fair Havens. Sounds pretty good. Well, I'll tell you what, it was sure good to get off that boat and get my feet on some solid ground. Just feeling earth under you is a wonderful thing. And I guess it was there at Fair Havens that I finally accepted the fact that I wouldn't be getting home to see my family before the spring. Because it looked like we would be spending the winter there. The weather was showing no signs of improvement. And the people who seemed to know about this stuff said that it would soon be too late to even consider being out on the Mediterranean. Apparently, there's times of the year when if you have any brains, you just don't go there. You just don't go out on the water. And yet, there was still some talk of the ship sailing on. Well, after we had been there for a good while, word was sent around that the ship would indeed be moving on. And there was quite a bit of debate about that, whether that was a good idea or not. But the thing is, they just wanted to go a short ways. They just wanted to go about 40 miles further along the coast to another port that was supposed to be a bigger port and a better place for the ship to spend the winter and a nicer place for us to stay in. And of course, the passengers, they were free to stay there or they could continue on with the ship. It was really up to us. And Paul came and he shared with me some of his concerns about heading out to sea at this time of the year. He told me that he had personally himself already experienced 3 shipwrecks in his life, and he wasn't interested in enduring another one. And he told me that he had some concerns about the overall condition of the ship, and he feared that if we went out, there very well could be some loss of lives. But what do? I talked around and I heard from the other people. It seemed like everyone else was deciding to go, and I had to figure this out. I figured that, if the owner and the crew of the ship, if they were willing to risk their lives and willing to risk the ship itself and willing to risk the cargo, which is the whole thing that gave them money, then surely the danger must not be too great. They wouldn't risk all of that, would they? So in a couple of days, the weather turned nice finally, and they decided to go, and we were off. And it was a good plan. It was straightforward. We would stay close to the shore. We wouldn't be way out there in the middle. And in a few hours, we would just move up the coast to this new port of Phoenix, and we could settle in for the winter. The ship would be safe. Everything would be good. And that's how it was working. Everything was going really nicely according to plan. And then the nightmare began. It happened so quickly you cannot imagine. It's just like 1 second, everything is calm and we're just going along and there's the coast, and then just like in a second, out of nowhere, this gale from the northeast just tore into us. Suddenly the waves are churning all around and the whole ship was, I thought that great big ship was just going to roll right over in the water and dump us in. The wind just simply overpowered us. And the next thing we knew, the coastline was behind us and it was quickly disappearing. We were leaving land and leaving it quick. And there's all kinds of activity. The crew was furiously working to bring the ship under control. Most of the passengers scrambled down under deck. They were like, whoa, what's going on? And I heard the captain say that our only hope was a little island to the south called Clauda. Well, we saw Clauda. It was spotted, the island of Clauda. And when they spotted it, they realized the path that we were on, there was no hope of us reaching it. However, the only thing it did for us, that island, was it provided, as we got on the other side of it, just enough of a break from the wind to allow the crew to make some storm preparations. And my soldiers and I told my soldiers, hey, we're soldiers. We're going to help out here. And so we helped out the crew. We helped hoist this little boat that was pulled behind the ship. We had to bring it up on deck. How hard is that? Believe me, it's harder than you think. Waves, everything's going on. This little boat was full of water, and we had to try to drag it up on top. It was not easy. Next thing that had to happen, the crew secured several long, thick ropes underneath the ship, right around its hull. These ropes all around it. And I'm like, why are we doing this? Well, they were supposed to help strengthen the ship and hold it together in the violent water. Isn't that encouraging? And as signs of leaking began to show, I remembered Paul's concerns about the condition of this ship, and his concerns seemed a whole lot more valid all of a sudden. But the fear of sinking wasn't our only concern. In fact, it wasn't our worst problem. The biggest thing was if we were apparently to keep going in the direction the wind was blowing us, and we were going there quick, we would end up in the sandy shallows north of Africa. Another way to say that is we would end up in the quicksands north of Africa. And if we were to hit those, we would go down and we wouldn't come back up. It would be all over. That would have been our most dangerous situation. And so the crew said, we have got to get this ship turned around somehow to face more into the wind, because the way we're going straight to our grave. And what that meant was the biggest sail in the middle of the ship with all of the rigging, that would have to be brought down from the main center mast, and all of that stuff would have to be stored on the deck so the wind couldn't have as much chance to push us. And man, the wind just continued to relentlessly smack against that ship with all of its force. I can assure you that first night, nobody slept a wink. By the next day, the storm seemed to be getting worse instead of getting better, which we didn't think was possible. And so it was decided that most of the cargo should be thrown overboard to help lighten the ship. So we helped out with that, throw all the stuff they were supposed to be taking, throw it overboard. Hopefully that would result in less water coming into the ship. It would ride a little higher on the water, maybe take in a little less. Then the next day, with no signs of the storm breaking, they decided to take that sail and rigging, all that stuff that we had brought down and put on the deck, and all of the other equipment that could possibly be spared, and they were like, time to throw this overboard as well. And so we helped with that. Now you stop and think about this. When the owner of the ship is willing to throw out all of the cargo, that's all of his profit, that's his livelihood, and throw out all of his equipment, that's also his livelihood. You're throwing away everything you can get away with throwing away on your boat. When you do that, you know the situation is gravely serious. It had come to the point, we were at a point where nothing mattered but simply to make it through this alive. Who cares about the cargo? Who cares about money? Who cares about the ship? Who cares about anything? We just got to survive. All that could be done had now been done. And our only hope was for the storm to either die out or for us to somehow find land. But the hope of finding land was very slim, since the crew had absolutely no idea whatsoever where we were. I mean, we knew where we were. We were out in the middle of the Mediterranean somewhere, but that's it. We were just out there somewhere. To get an idea of our approximate location, they needed to be able to see either the sun or the stars. But it had been so dark and overcast with the storm that neither one of those things had been seen in days. It was so dark, you didn't hardly know when it was day and when it was night. And at that point, I was no longer thinking about when I would see my family again. I was now thinking about if I would ever see my family again. And the thoughts that go through your mind, how does that work? I just never come back. And they wonder what happened to me. Would they ever even know? As the days passed by, hope of the storm clearing started to give out, and people's morale began to plummet with their sinking hopes. Let me tell you what, it was not pleasant being on that ship, if you think about it. Half the people were seasick. You know what happens when people are seasick? At least up on the deck, the waves and the rain washed most of it away, but it was too wet to be up there. It was too wet to sleep up there, so that meant most of the people were down below, and down below, it was starting to smell pretty foul, as you can imagine. It wasn't a good situation. Everybody's on edge. Most people had slept very little. Most had hardly eaten a thing. People were trying to cope with the very real possibility of their upcoming death. Some people's tempers flared under the strain of the situation. I saw grown men just simply break down in tears and just start weeping. Because we were struck with this overwhelming sense of how stupid it was for us all to die for what? Just so we could go a few miles down the coast and be in a nicer place for the winter. What a rotten reason to give up your life. Plagued us. But you know what? There was one notable exception to the heavy blanket of doom that wrapped all around that ship. And I guess with everything that had been going on, I hadn't really talked with Paul and his friends since before the storm had begun. And truthfully, honestly, I suppose I was probably a bit ashamed to face him, since I had disregarded all of his warnings, and now it seemed like every single one of his fears were all coming true. I was kind of embarrassed. I had seen them from a distance praying to their God. Like so many other people on that ship had been appealing to their gods in their own ways. And I don't know, one day it just seemed like everyone was sitting around. What could you do? There was nothing to do. Just ride it out. We're lost in the silence of self-pity and despair. I don't think anybody even noticed him get up and move to the center of the ship because what did it matter? But then he started talking. It was Paul. And I don't know, as he started to talk, there was just a calm about him that just seemed to draw the attention of the whole ship. I guess there was really nothing else to do but to listen. And he began by reminding us that he had warned us about this calamity, but then he told us that he had some good news. He assured us that no one's life would be lost, even though the ship would be ruined. Well, how did he know that? Apparently, he had been praying to his God that everyone on the ship would be saved. And his God, he said, had sent an angel to confirm that he would appear before the emperor and that everyone on the ship would live. Is that good news? Well, he predicted that we would run again aground on an island, and he told us to take heart because he was sure that his God would do as the angel promised. And this was shocking news to a ship full of people who are just filled with utter despair. I mean, how do you take something like that? Paul and his companions had gained, I think, the general respect of everyone on the ship. But for some people, this news was just a little too much to believe, right? Oh, an angel came and told you we're all going to survive this? And yet for myself, and I think perhaps for many others, if nothing else, it stirred up the embers of hope that had died out in my heart. You know, it gave me a little something to think about. And I'm not the type of person who would normally believe in a divine revelation like that. But there was just something about Paul that made you feel like, what he said must be true. There was such a calm sincerity to his words. You felt like he really believed what he told us. And I looked at the faces of Dr. Luke and Aristarchus because I wanted to know, are they buying this? Do they believe this stuff? And they too revealed a peace that no one else on that ship had. So over the next few days, I watched those men. I talked with Paul and his friends. And as I did, I became more and more convinced that there was hope. Maybe I would see my wife and my daughter again. Well, the horror continued day after day until the 14th night from when we left Fair Havens. Now, to be honest with you, of course, I wouldn't have had a clue it was the 14th night. I had no idea. The only reason I know that is from Dr. Luke, because he kept a record of what happened every day. He was one of those guys who kept track and wrote it down. And he said, this is now the 14th day since we left Fair Havens. So I know it was the 14th night. But it was on that night that some of the crew first detected the sounds of breakers hitting ashore. Exactly. That was a good sign. I mean, finally we had come to land. Man, no one knew which land it was. Then again, nobody cared what land it was. We'd take any land we could get. Just get us off this ship. It was such an exciting time for such a short time. The initial excitement that surged through the passengers was very soon deadened when we learned that it would be impossible to beach the ship in the darkness of the night. They said to do that would almost certainly leave us dashed against some unknown rocky coast. So what they did is they put out 4 anchors from the stern, the back of the boat, to hold it in place, to keep it pointing toward this land, whatever this land was, until the morning. And there we sat. And the thought of sinking now, after coming through all of that for 2 weeks, after getting probably within a quarter mile of land on the shore, and the thought of now we might sink and die, that close yet so far. That was just a sickening thought, but it was a very real possibility. And we were soon to find out just how real it was. I noticed that the crew were lowering that little boat back into the water, the one we had pulled up on the first day, and I sent a soldier over to inquire about what was happening, and he was told that they needed to set out some anchors from the front of the ship to hold it in place. Well, sounds reasonable, right? Not a bad idea. But just then, Paul rushed over to me, And he said, if you let them all escape in that little boat, there will be no hope of us being saved. They are the only ones who know how to beach this ship. Man, I didn't even have to tell my soldiers what to do. It was only a matter of seconds before they had gone and they cut the ropes to that little boat and let it go. If the crew wanted to save themselves, they were going to have to stick it out with the rest of us on the boat and save us as well. I was so mad at myself. Why hadn't I noticed that the whole crew had gathered there? Does that make sense? It takes the whole crew to get in a little boat and put out some anchors? Of course not. Their plan seemed so obvious. They were going to ditch us, let us die, and go to safety. We owed our lives to Paul. And I didn't know if it was just his experience with sailing. I didn't know if his God had given him some kind of special wisdom. I don't know what happened. Whatever the case, all I know is I was grateful that he intervened. And that didn't help matters. That incident with the crew trying to abandon us seemed to make everyone even more nervous as we agonized through the longest night of our lives. This was worse than all the other nights. And once again, it was Paul who brought a change to the mood. Just as we were beginning to think that for the first time in history, morning had forgotten to get up, Paul made another speech. He reminded us that most of us had hardly eaten a thing for the last 2 weeks. He reminded us that if we were going to get off this doomed vessel, we would need some strength. And he encouraged us to eat. And he again assured us that all on the ship would be saved. And then he took some food, and he asked for his God's blessing on the food, and he started eating. And we sat there and we watched him eating. And watching him eating, somehow, seeing him enjoy that food, it kind of revived everyone's appetite. And you know what happened? For the first time in 2 weeks, everybody started eating. Not just a nibble here or there. It's like people ate a meal. And eating seemed to break the tension, revive our hope a little bit. Well, morning light finally did come. And when it did, the sailors saw a place where they thought that they could beach the ship. And I can tell you, every single person was on the deck to watch what was going to happen. Nobody was snoozing downstairs. And we saw the place. They let off the anchors. We were heading towards shore, and it was looking so nice. And then all of a sudden, we were all literally instantly knocked right off our feet. Just dominoes of people all over the place. What had happened, I guess, the front of the ship became lodged on a sandbar that no one could have known was there. There we are, stuck on that sandbar, and what was happening now is you could hear the relentless waves smacking against the back of the ship, and that poor old ship that had gone through 2 weeks, somehow held together, was at its breaking point, and the ship was literally falling apart. It was breaking apart, and you could hear it. My soldiers and I had gathered all of the prisoners together on deck before we had set sail for the shore. And we had a pretty good plan. We would get to the shore, half of the soldiers would climb down to the beach first, then we would send the prisoners down, followed by the rest of the soldiers. That way we wouldn't lose any of them. But now what do? We're stuck on this sandbar. And no one was going to get to shore now unless they swam in or unless they floated in with some debris. So now what do? How do we possibly make sure that none of the prisoners would escape in a situation like that? You can't just have a free-for-all, everybody go. So my men came to a very quick consensus. They said our only option is to kill the prisoners, or else we run the risk of having them try to swim away and escape. Now, I don't know, maybe that sounds kind of cruel to you. But you've got to understand the situation that we were in. We were put in charge by the Roman Empire of those prisoners. And that meant that if even one of them were to escape, we were doomed. The loss of a prisoner meant the death sentence for us, or at least for me, because they were put under my care. It's a strange thing, but the law permitted us in this situation to be able to kill the prisoners, but it didn't permit us to allow even one of them to escape. So what do? All of my training, all of my experience told me that the decision of my soldiers was the right one. It was the only logical, sensible decision and solution. And yet there was something in my mind that just wouldn't let me do it, Like, how could I possibly allow a man like Paul to be killed? After all, wasn't it him, his quick thinking, who had just a few hours earlier had saved us? Wasn't it him who had given us hope when everybody was in despair? How could I now just turn around and kill him? Thanks so much for all your help. Sorry you got to die. How do you do that? And yet it wasn't Paul that I was worried about trying to escape. Could I trust these other prisoners? Some of those guys were kind of shifty, you know? And the thing is, then there was Paul's God. Now, I had not only grown to respect Paul, but I also developed a bit of a healthy respect for his God because I noticed that so far, Paul's God had been keeping all of his promises. And to be honest with you, I wasn't so sure that I wanted to be the one to try to break that routine. I didn't want to take on Paul's God and try to prove his promises wrong. You know what I mean? This was by far the most important decision of my life. And am I ever glad that I made the decision I did? Because I just couldn't do it. I just couldn't let Paul be killed. There had to be another way. I had to take the risk. So I ordered my soldiers, all of them, to get in the water first and head for shore. Once I saw that they were on shore, then the plan was they were to fan out throughout that whole shore, best defense ever, so that they could collect all of the prisoners as they came swimming in or floating in. And then one by one, because I'm not foolish, one by one I loosened the chains of those prisoners enough so that they could move freely enough to get themselves in. I didn't send them all at once like a blitz, I just sent them one by one. And I kept Paul to the last so that I could help him if he needed some help. And you know what, as I went up to him to loosen his chains, I looked in his eyes and I just knew that I made the right decision. And instead of just loosening Paul's chains, you know what, I just took them off. I just took them off. He didn't need to be in chains. I guess in a way we both helped save each other's life, and it was my way of saying thank you to him. And I am happy to report to you that we all made it safely to shore, and not even one prisoner even tried to escape. These guys were just so happy to be off that boat, they didn't care if they were still prisoners. And had I chosen differently at that crucial moment, I believe I would have always, for the rest of my life, been tormented by my decision. I would have always wondered if it had really been necessary to take that step of killing someone like Paul. Well, just like Paul had predicted, we had landed on an island. It was the island of Malta, to be exact. And here, oh man, some more adventures awaited us. You can't imagine. But that's another whole story. I'll leave that for another time. Now that's worth an amen. It is an amazing and exciting story recorded in Acts 27. There's some pretty amazing stories in the Bible. And as that storm-tossed ship rose and fell with each wave it met, so the hopes and fears of the characters just seem to swell and crash throughout that story as it just goes from crisis to crisis to crisis. And yet even in the terror of that storm, Paul's faith remains firm. He trusts in the promises of his God. And in spite of the grave personal danger and hardship that he was in, how interesting that he intentionally remembered to pray for everyone else on that ship. Their safety, their courage, their salvation is his concern as he prays in the heaving hull of that ship. Wow, what a witness Paul and his companions proved to be during that terrible ordeal. And what an influence they must have been on the others in that ship. And I think just how strong that influence is, or was, is perhaps best shown by the centurion Julius. Because after surviving all the dangers of that storm, such a short way from the safety of shore, suddenly Paul's life is put ironically in the greatest danger of the whole voyage. The threat to his life is no longer the violence of nature, but rather it comes the decision of one man. One man decides if he lives or if he dies. The soldiers have said, Julius, come on, we've got to kill them. And look at it with me, just one verse, if you got your Bible. Acts 27, verse 43. We're very close to the end. Be of good courage. Acts 27, verse 43. Because I really think this is the climax of the story. Acts 27, verse 43. It says, but the centurion, wanting to save Paul, kept them from their purpose and commanded that those who could swim should jump overboard first and get to land. It's really amazing what that Bible text says. Here, the centurion Julius risks not only his own life, he risks the lives of all of his soldiers just to save Paul's life. That's not normal. Why in the world would he do that? I think it goes to show just how much respect he had developed for Paul in that relatively short time that he had had to interact with this apostle in chains. And because that basis of respect had been built, the Holy Spirit could then speak to the centurion's conscience, I believe, and encourage him to spare Paul's life and consequently all of the prisoners' lives. I think that Paul and his companions must have lived such a life right from the beginning that Julius could see there was something different about these men. Paul had consistently proved to be trustworthy. He did that all the time he was in prison, and now as he came under the direction of Julius, and he was rewarded. He was rewarded on the second day of the journey when he was allowed to go into town and see his friends in Sidon. But it was this day-to-day consistent living that provided a basis for trust and respect. But then the severe trials came, and people were able to see now what Paul was really made of. As many people would have lost hope and despair, they could see the strength of his relationship with the Lord. They could see that his faith held firm. And I think at that point, probably, no doubt, many who had simply respected him before, yeah, he's a nice guy. I think then they maybe became more interested in the source of his peace and faith, don't you think? What a witness Paul and his Christian brothers were now able to share in the testimony of their lives. And I believe it must have been at least partly the influence of that witness that would cause this centurion to make the decision he did that we read about in verse 43. In her book, Education, Ellen White briefly refers to 3 Bible stories. The Bible story of Elisha when he was surrounded by a band of heavenly angels, the story of Peter when an angel delivered him from prison, and this story of Paul. Paul here dealing with this experience on the sea. And directly after she mentions those stories, this is what she wrote. These things were not written merely that we might read and wonder, oh, good story, but that the same faith which wrought in God's servants of old might work in us. In no less marked a manner than he wrought then will he work now, wherever there are hearts of faith to be channels of his power. It's not just a story. It's a story that has and should have impact on us. Do you ever feel like you're caught in the raging storm of trials? Does that ever happen to you? Ever feel like you're in the middle of a storm? Perhaps I want to say to you, take courage, because perhaps it is at these times of hardship, like at no other times, that God can use our abiding hope and faith in him to witness to others. It's such a strange thing. Sometimes our greatest trial is our greatest opportunity for witness. I wish it was easier, but our greatest trial can be our greatest witness opportunity. Perhaps it is at these times when others would lose hope that those people who have learned to respect us or think that we're at least nice, maybe it's then that they will take a closer look at just what our relationship with Jesus is all about. How important it is then, if that is true, that during the calm times, if you're not in a storm of life, thank God, but during the calm times, our lives need to reflect a consistent dependence on and love for Jesus. And if people can learn to respect and trust us during these times, then I think they will be more apt to look at how we cope in times of struggle. And there are many people today who are frightened. You know, they're people who are seeing the stormy winds that are blowing in these last days of Earth's history, and they're afraid. They need hope. They need peace, and they don't really know where to get it. And could it be that some, perhaps more than we realize, are looking to us to see if our faith is really doing us any good? Is it just a bunch of talk? Or when the rubber meets the road, does it matter? Because of Paul's faith and witness, a whole shipload of people were saved. Think of the powerful witness of those 3 men. And I would say to us today, may God help us to so live for him today, so that come good or bad, we can represent him.